On September 30th, 2015, Vladimir Putin ordered Russian warplanes into Syria to begin regular aerial bombardments of targets which Moscow defined as sources of, quote, jihadi terror. The intervention obviously followed an official invitation from the embattled regime of Assad, who had asked the his Russian ally to help against forces that he called jihadists. Since the Kremlin's official statement described them as forces which threaten peace and stability within and beyond Syrian borders, most observers at the time initially assumed that Putin's main ambition was to destroy the Islamic State, al-Nusra, and other terrorist formations. It soon became apparent that this was not the case. From the outset, the Russian warplanes targeted primarily not ISIS, but the Free Syrian Army and other organizations considered moderate, yet threatening for the Alawite regime strategic centers. Only in November 2015 did the Russians shift their military focus to the Islamic State in order to strike its oil tankers and refineries. Still, experts agree that had Putin's primary objective in Syria been to fight ISIS, he would have joined the international coalition. Russia has no plans to stop its bombing campaign against rebel positions in Syria until Moscow's allies in Damascus can achieve peace on favorable terms. Russia's Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev tells us as much in his latest interviews. Russia will continue to target any Assad's opponents, he says, not only ISIS. Quote, they are all bandits and terrorists, unquote. So there are several expected, more or less predictable answers as to why Moscow decided to intercede on Assad's behind. Putin obviously very clearly wished to present himself as a loyal friend to Assad and to aid his principal Arab ally of many years, and the last one after Gaddafi, after the fall of the Gaddafi regime. This is especially so because Moscow views the war in Syria as a conspiracy orchestrated by the anti-Shia Western and Arab state to topple the pro-Iranian Assad. Russians believe that the West and its Syrian Sunni allies are following the old tactic of the 1979-1989 Afghan war against the Soviet Union, exploiting the jihadists, all sorts of jihadists, to topple a regional opponent without any regard for the kind of monster they breed. Understandably, Putin wishes to preserve Assad's regime, yet this does not explain why he decided actively to help Assad only after almost 4 years since the outbreak of the Syrian civil war in the spring of 2011. In any case, by intervening now, Putin wanted time to be perfect, to be right for his own objectives before he entered the Syrian gambit. Certain commentators claim that Putin decided to get involved in the conflict primarily to distract NATO and the United States from his aggressive actions in the Ukraine. This argument may be problematic because the NATO states generally reacted negatively to Kremlin's aid to Assad. Our belief is that there will never be peace in Syria while President Assad is there. Others think differently, John Kerry said, obviously pointing his finger at the Russians. By openly coming out on the side of the dictator, Putin has worsened, not improved his international image and standing. There's also an economic factor, of course. Russia is a petrostate whose federal budget depends heavily on energy exports. For example, 68% of the total revenues in 2013, we know, originated from the national gas and oil exports. So naturally, Russia is concerned that the energy thirsty Europe is seeking other sources of oil and natural gas that will reduce its own dependency on Russia. Therefore, some have argued Russia needs to increase its presence in the Middle East. It seems that they can, to control the oil. It seems, however, that the economic factor is overrated, especially given the lamentable reality of Russia's domestic finances, the state of the ruble, crippled as they are by the US sanctions, which followed Putin's Crimean affair. With the oil prices plummeting, carrying the ruble down with them, Putin has to have really good reasons to impose on his country great additional expenses of military entertainments in Syria. Russia simply cannot afford them, nor can it afford the deteriorating relations between Moscow and NATO countries. Had gas and oil exports and economic considerations generally been of primary importance, Russia would have been more likely to collaborate with Western policy in Syria, undoing perhaps some of the damage made in the Ukraine. Instead, Putin defies the West and insists on his own way, one that counteracts NATO effort. Some experts have been arguing that Syria hosts one of the two Russian military bases outside the former USSR, the other being in Vietnam. There is and that this is the sole Russian naval base in the Mediterranean since the end of the Cold War. Some have suggested that had Russia not already established this military base in Syria, military operation support of Assad might have been aborted. As in the case of Gaddafi's Libya, we just don't know this. This is all maybe, maybe not. We have no idea what would have been, obviously. There are many other less important arguments and side factors which might have influenced Putin to get involved. There include, for example, Putin's aversion to what he called were called color revolutions and popular uprising, which experts argue partially explain the intervention. Another factor is his desire to deal sort of Russian style with scores of Chechen and Central Asian jihadists in Syria, to where they have migrated by the thousand. As much as he might have liked to settle scores, Putin knows how to control himself. He does obviously wish to wipe out the separatist Muslim insurgencies in the Russian Caucasus and in Tajikistan, but he obviously not trying to do this via fighting the Chechens and the Tajik jihadists in Syria. Okay. Finally, many analysts have noted what may be termed a humiliation factor, which has been a consideration for the Russian foreign policy after the breakdown of the USSR and Russia's loss of extensive territories, which Putin considered the greatest, and I quote him, the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, end of quote. He has made consistent effort to undo the collapse of the USSR, or as much as possible to reduce its outcome by acting aggressively, first against Georgia and then against the Ukraine. Incidentally, Putin views both crises as part of the consistent policy on the part of the United States and NATO to weaken Russia still further, or at least keep its president from restoring Russia to the pre-1989 status as the world power. So the argument is that in Syria, Putin seeks to portray Russia as a superpower and to compensate for the 2 decades of what many in Putin's entourage call submissive foreign policy. And of course, this term is employed primarily vis-a-vis the United States, with which Moscow has entered a new phase of the Cold War, specifically in Putin's 3rd term in office, if we are to judge by his officials, and particularly Medvedev's latest affirmations. So, given the weak American response to the ISIS challenge, Kremlin, perhaps, some people argue, seeks to show that it is the Russians who know how to do the job right for a change. Russia may thus be expanding its presence in the traditionally US sphere of influence and promoting itself on the international arena. However, no matter how important these factors are, none of the geopolitical considerations above are, I feel, even all of them together explain entirely Putin's rationale for becoming involved in the Syrian predicament. Even combined, all of them do not seem to justify the new Russian adventure into the territory where many warn the Russians are likely to get in trouble, at least potentially. The East is a delicate affair. So has it a famous line from a very, very popular Russian film, and everyone in Russia, literally every single person in Russia knows it. This phrase is being repeated time and time again. Also, the horrible experiences in Afghanistan and Chechnya are also very fresh in memory. So, Western scholars have a tradition of explaining Russia's Middle Eastern policy initiatives, especially aggressive ones, by Russia's wish to have access to the Mediterranean Sea. And invariably, the argument is as follows. Since the time of the Tsars, Moscow has longed for an exodus to the warm waters of the Mediterranean and the riches of the Near East, since geography has not graced this northern ice-capped country with serviceable ports throughout the year. But, in fact, the naval base in Sebastopol in the Crimea does not freeze during the winter. So why not ask? If this argument doesn't really explain things well, why not ask if there are deeper causes for this political behavior, which Russian leaders pursue time and again, despite many perils and predictable troubles, both at home and abroad. Perhaps the urgency to have access to the Mediterranean, which is bordering on obsession, is not restricted to strategic or economic factors. Is it possible that the tendency to intervene in foreign conflicts has to do with patterns of Russian historical development and, on a more profound level, reveal an essential, if unappreciated, patterns in the Russian political culture? These patterns may in fact have become an integral part of the Russian national identity, guiding its leaders and determining policy. To understand them, we must look at their origins, traceable as far back as the 15th century. So in case anyone doesn't remember, in 1453, Byzantine Empire was defeated by the Turks. In Russia, the fall of Constantinople was seen as divine punishment to the Greeks for straying away from the orthodoxy. Then in 1492, a major religious figure called Moscow, quote, the new city of Constantine, the original capital of Christianity. Then, in the first quarter of the 16th century, another very well-known religious family, figure, wrote a memorandum to the Tsar Vasily III, in which he developed the idea further. And this is what he said. The first Rome and the second Rome, i.e. Constantinople, had lapsed into heresy, ceased to be center of the Christian world, and should be replaced by Moscow. Due to the great sins, 2 Romes have fallen, the third stands, and the fourth will not be. Until the day of final redemption, Moscow will be the spiritual center of the whole Christian world. From then on, this idea became known as Moscow, the third Rome. So Russia's role was to be properly messianic. Moscow is thus charged with special responsibility with the salvation of all humanity, no more, no less. For centuries, the doctrine remained an integral part of the Russian national mythology and the fundamental principle of the official ideology of the Russian state. The dogma justified Russia's imperial ambitions, legitimized by the messianic idea that it was Russia's destiny to be, quote, light upon the nations and to lead the world, which had lost its true faith, to the final salvation. Since then, the Russians have been persistently taught that ordinary and secular history is suffused with religious significance, and its political history, the culminating chapter of a sequence of historical events leading up to and including the apocalypse, has to be realized. The central reality of this apocalyptic history is an historical event that can be seen with great frequency throughout the records of Russian history. The key here is that Russia's messianic role is assumed regardless of the nature of the political regime, be it Tsarist, Soviet, or post-Soviet. Historians have underscored various parallels between this conception of Russia's special historical responsibilities as the head of the true Christian church and the Soviet Union's special historical responsibilities as the guardian of one true Marxist-Leninist doctrine of communism. Putin adopted the idea for the post-Soviet state. Following the 2008 economic crisis and the 2011 public protest against election frauds, Putin realized that he could not sustain his regime's legitimacy or maintain mass support without a messianic mission based on traditional foundations. Putin did not invent this new ideology. He merely reformulated and popularized among his citizens a key concept, that of Russia's quote-unquote greatness, that their state is, quote, great, is in the traditional lexicon, means that it pursues messianic goals, directing the world historical process. And Putin clearly knew what he was doing. Indeed, over the centuries, the Russians have absorbed these messianic patterns. To be good and popular leader in the eyes of the citizens means to be a messianic leader pursuing a messianic foreign policy. This in turn means essentially to become actively involved in what is perceived as apocalyptic experiences, those who have a potential to lead to a spectacular apocalyptic-like development. 2 seconds. The Syrian conflict undoubtedly carries this potential. It is an opportunity for the Russians in which the traditional Russian leader must play a key role. After all, he is representing what they see as light upon the nation and the culture of light, which represents light upon the nations, which must lead the way to the dramatic playoff of human history. Needless to say, Middle East has special attention in this respect. 5 seconds. According to a major national survey conducted a few days after the beginning of Russia's intervention in the Syrian civil war, more than two-thirds, 68% of the responders followed the development in Syria. 62% thought that Russia should not remain neutral. 56% of the people asked blamed not the Syrian rebels or Assad for the prolonged and bloody conflict, but the US and its allies. 66 supported Putin's decision to begin air raids. About a month later, Putin's approval rating has reached an all-time high, nearly 90%, largely thanks to his military moves in Syria, according to a national-wide poll. Russian people today are oppressed politically and economically, and their governmental policies at home and abroad are highly unlikely to alleviate this oppression. Yet the Russians support Putin's Middle Eastern adventures, which are a clear message to his citizens. His policy in Syria is in line with Russia's national messianic aspirations, outlined by the Time Honored Doctorate of Moscow's the Third Rome. In the eyes of the Russians, Putin is the great leader. And I'm just going to end by noting that just before, a couple of days before this, before presenting this lecture, before today, I Googled in Russian the word popularity. Okay, just simply wrote in Russian, popularity in Russian. First option that came up was popularity of Putin. Okay, thank you very much.